We're going to see the president resort to his typical techniques of sowing this kind of chaos and division, as you mentioned, using the word thugs, calling out these protesters. And by the way, the president's been late on this situation all week long, late to react to the video of what happened in Minneapolis, late to react to the protests and the unrest. We are far past the point where the president should be weighing in for the first time on these matters. Clearly, the situation's out of control in parts of Minneapolis. The city of Minneapolis is doing a very bad job communicating with its own residents right now. Of course, under the cover of darkness, we don't know everything that's happening, but it is clear there are fires and looted stores and broken windows and other disturbances in multiple neighborhoods of Minneapolis right now. We'll have to wait until sunrise to get the full picture. Amid all of this, you have to wonder, if you live in Minneapolis right now, do you feel any better seeing the President of the United States talk the way he's talking on Twitter? I'm going to wager no, Michael, but let's see what the residents of Minneapolis say in the morning.
I'm really sorry, Tim, that you had to listen to Brian Stelter for such a long time. Some of you may have felt your estrogen levels rise and spontaneously felt a little bit sick in the tum-tum. But
yeah, I'm sorry, guys. I shouldn't. We went a little long there. That's on me. I sent the clip to producer Mark. So sometimes I forget that I can't subject you to too much Stelter. I'm trying. I need to protect your ears. I need to protect your minds.
Jeff Zucker said this, so I said, okay, Mr. Zucker, whatever you tell me.
Oh, the worst. Really, really, in so many ways, is the absolute worst host on, certainly the worst host at CNN. I don't know if we could say all cable news. So there's that. There is that indeed. Now let's get into where this all goes from here. Let's see where this goes. Oh wait, I'm sorry. I was gonna say what's gonna happen in Minneapolis, but hold on. I got stuck in the Zucker conversation. But let's talk about, because Zucker, Stelter, they're ruining CNN. I mean, Stelter's just a little hatchet man, but Jeff Zucker has destroyed the reputation, whatever it was, of the cable news network. I listened to the old days from back in the old days, and I think they've brought it back, where they had James Earl Jones, one of the greatest. And I'm somebody who really spends a lot of time thinking about voices because I think it matters. If you're going to spend a lot of time,
listen to somebody with a really high, terrible voice who's yelling all the time.
That's no fun, right? You don't want to do that. Why would you do that? That's brutalizing your ears to listen to radio hosts who sound like that. So I'm somebody who cares about one's voice when you're listening. And James Earl Jones has one of the greatest voices of all time, and he does this is. I mean, I can't. I'm not even going to pretend to do it because his version is so much better than anyone that I could do. But this is CNN. It was always liberal, but it used to be an organization that at least felt some obligation to pretend it could show respect, or at least platform the other side a little bit in debate. And now that's all gone, and that's all just a complete joke. And that's why, the focus here from Stelter.
Donald Trump is so slow in the process. Donald Trump is it.
Hold on a second. How is Donald Trump slow? I just had the president interview, and we talked about this, and he's like, it's a horrible situation. And by the way, I'll agree with you. You know why I can't do Trump impressions? Because I have too much respect for the man, and it's my heart's not in it. That's the problem. My heart's not, because everyone else I've been able to look at my Cuomo. That's come out of nowhere. People love the Cuomo impersonation. I go, why? It is a little bit like Christopher Walken, but it's like if Christopher Walken was kind of more thuggish and dumb. Oh, thuggish. You're not allowed to say, and by the way, I think Christopher Walken's probably a nice guy, but you can't say thug. We've seen that again from Stelter.
The president referred to them as thugs.
We're going to do this again. We're going to pretend that there are words that we can't use to describe. If someone who is a white Antifa member runs up to a store and breaks in the window and throws in a Molotov cocktail, that person can be accurately described as a thug. If an African American runs into a store with, a bandana on his face or around his face and and steals something after breaking the window, that person can be referred to as a thug. A thug is a reference irrespective of one's ethnic background or religion or anything else. It's a reference to bad conduct, and it is applicable across the board. And this is also where, for those of you, in case you do not know, the word thug has a very interesting derivation. It comes from the period of British colonial rule in India. So if anyone should be upset about the usage of the term thug, you would think it would be Indians, and I mean that in the proper sense of people from South Asia, Indians who have had this term appropriated from the original Hindu, thugi, and it referred to a death cult. And for those of you that are wondering, what do we know about this death cult? And the word initially meant one who was one who engaged in deception, and they were a strangulation cult during the period of the British control of India. And the Brits actually got rid of them in the 19th century. The Brits tracked them down, and they worshipped a god of death. I believe I actually don't remember the name of the god of death, but if you've seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, that group that does the we must drink the blood of the Kalima and all that stuff, right? And the guy rips the heart out of the chest, and the flame pit and all that, the lava pit, flame's lava. Indiana Jones, the Temple of Doom, I think, is clearly the worst of the Indiana Jones. There's only 3 movies in the trilogy. If you tell me Shia LaBeouf was in an Indiana Jones movie, you have made a mistake. We just wave our hand and say, no, there was no Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Do you agree with me, Producer Mark, that the Temple of Doom is the worst of the 3?
Yes, I do agree with that.
See, I like when I can get Producer Mark to actually agree with me on things. I won't ask you if Raiders of the Lost Ark or Last Crusade is the best, because I think that's a tough call. I think it's a little bit like saying, who wins in a fight, Wolverine or the Incredible Hulk, although I guess probably the Incredible Hulk, right?
Yeah,
I don't know.
The Hulk wins.
The Hulk wins that one, right? Yeah. Yeah, this is this is a total digression, but it's Friday, so I feel like I'm allowed to have digressions. Some of the Avengers, I feel like they're true superheroes, and some of them I'm like, why is this person a superhero? There's a guy who's got a metal wings, he flies around with them on or whatever. I'm like, you're a superhero? You're a guy that has really cool military equipment. I don't know if that makes you and the other guy who's really good with the bow and arrow, I'm sorry, I've actually fired many a bow and arrow, and you'd much rather have a gun. I can tell you that. Right, Producer Mark?
They don't really have guns in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Well, a laser then, or something like that.
And the reason, I think you're referring to Iron Man with the wings and everything?
No. Iron Man's cool. Tony Stark is a great character.
But Iron Man would literally be the definition of somebody who doesn't technically have superpowers. He built his superpowers.
But his suit is really cool. I'm talking about the guy, I think his name is Falcon.
No, his name's escaping me.
Is it not Falcon?
No, it's not.
I don't know. Producer Nick might weigh in here. But it's anyway, he's. I saw him in Winter Soldier. See, Producer Mark convinced me to actually watch some of these movies. I watched Winter Soldier.
It's
good.
Hawkeye.
Hawkeye. Oh, no, that's the bow and arrow guy.
Yeah,
Falcon is the guy with the wings. I'm right.
Falcon is the guy with the wings. Hawkeye is the guy with the bow and arrow.
There we go.
Yes.
Hawkeye's the guy I couldn't remember. Yeah. I mean, come on. You're running around with a bow. You got monster alien people that are blowing up worlds in space, and you're going to send a dude after them with a bow and arrow? I mean, is he going to crawl up a tree stand first and, put out some, he's going to make sure he's got the right camo on? I mean, this is absurd.
I mean, it's like extreme bow and arrow. It's like bow and arrow with superpowers.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
And it's supposed to not be realistic. It's a superhero movie.
I just hope that the Motor City Madman doesn't hear me talking smack about bow and arrows for superheroes. He's going to be like, Buck, I'll show you what we can do with a bow and arrow. Anyway. So, where I completely derailed us here for a second. Oh, I'm making fun of Brian Stelter. Thuggy cult, Indiana Jones, Temple of Doom. If you didn't know, that's believed to be where it comes from. They used to strangle people, travelers on the side of the road, and they believed that it was for their god of death. And they're really a bad bunch. Some estimates where they killed up to, I think it was 1 million people over the course of the 19th century. So bad stuff. Anyway, thug is not a racist term, and they're going to say that they're going to pretend that this is now just because they want to. Look, the media benefits, the left-wing Democrat media benefits from narratives of racial division because they position themselves, the people who have the platforms, who work for the legacy media outlets, they position themselves as the truth tellers. They position themselves as the not racist people, of course. And they are also, by all of their acts of, on-air penance, they're addressing their own, for the ones who are white, they're addressing their white privilege in real time on TV. This is, the problem with so much of this is that I can assure you this will all lead to nothing but destruction and angst and misery, and then will be forgotten. It's just a question now of how large the toll is, what the cost really ends up being, and hopefully no one loses their lives in the protests that will come. But this expression of rage, as they're calling it, does not result in better policies, does not result in the police doing their jobs differently, because there's always going to be the possibility of one bad officer. There's always going to be someone who is evil, who in any organization. There are evil people in media. I can start naming some names. Bad people. Now, they haven't killed anybody that I know of. Well, let me think about that. Well, yeah, they haven't killed anybody that I know of, but they're bad human beings. And that's never going to change. So if you have this expression of outrage and you don't have some ask or request or demand or however you want to phrase it, what do you want to go differently here? This guy is facing charges. He will likely spend the rest of his life or close to it in a cell. No cop that I've heard talk about this has said anything other than this is terrible and awful. And a lot of us watching that video of George Floyd were thinking, if only I could have been there, maybe I could have convinced the officer in time, or maybe I could have even thrown myself into the scene and pushed the officer off him just to get him enough air to keep him alive. You get arrested for that, obviously, but that would have been the moral thing to do in those circumstances. That would have been righteous and courageous. That's how evil that action by that law enforcement officer was. You breaking the law to stop him would have been the righteous thing. But burning down the buildings of innocent people, the businesses, destroying property, throwing rocks and assaulting police officers who are just doing their jobs, throwing Molotov cocktails at them, that's unjust. It's immoral. And the media should speak with one voice in the condemnation of this and not do this whole game of, well, sure, riots and looting is bad, but I can kind of understand why this is happening. And then, let's talk about the history of racism in the context, and calling racism a public health emergency. What does that even mean? This is what libs have been doing now. What is that supposed to mean? It doesn't even make sense. How do we address that as a health emergency? This is something that people say because they believe it sounds good, but have put no thought into it beyond that initial impulse to virtue signal and, of course, to bash your perceived political opponents. That's what's going on here. No good will come of this. I can't leave this out. There's something that came up last night in the midst of all of this just noise and the mess and everything we're seeing in Minneapolis. Something was said that I think raised a lot of eyebrows. You have the Hennepin County Attorney Michael Freeman, who was talking about the George Floyd video. Now, up to this point, one aspect of this crisis, and it is a crisis when you have over 100 businesses destroyed, burned down, you've got police letting a police precinct, I mean, think about the message that sends to bad guys all over the country, right? The police precinct gets burned down to the ground. There's an obvious crisis happening here, but all along we've been thinking this will be dealt with by the judicial system in a way where there will be punishment for those who killed George Floyd. Here's something I can't really imagine but here is what the Hennepin County Attorney Michael Freeman said of the video and some other unspecified stuff. Play 6.
It's a violation of my ethics to talk and evaluate evidence before we announce our charging decision, and I will not do that. I will say this, that video is graphic and horrific and terrible, and no person should do that. But my job in the end is to prove that he violated a criminal statute, and there is other evidence that does not support a criminal charge. We need to wade through all of that evidence and to come through with a meaningful determination, and we are doing that to the best of our ability.
You heard it. And this was, I mean, if this becomes what it sounds like it could be, where there's a real debate over the possible criminality of the officer here. I'm not saying we're there. Do not misconstrue or misunderstand what I'm saying. But if we get to that, with Eric Garner, for example, he had a heart condition. The takedown itself, he didn't sit there and strangle him for 8 minutes. The guy took him down around the neck, and then Garner, as he was arrested, had cardiac arrest. That's not the same thing as strangling somebody over a course of minutes as they're screaming that they are unable to breathe. It's not the same, right? But what is he referring to here with evidence that does not support a criminal charge? I don't know. The only speculation I could have here, and this is speculation, I do not have any evidence of this, would be perhaps there was an underlying medical condition that was exacerbated by the knee on the neck. However, even in that circumstance, it would seem to me that a knee on the neck is excessive force, and if that excessive force continuously in this context leads to death, it's still manslaughter. But I'm wondering what this county attorney is referring to with evidence that does not support. Maybe he just meant that in a very generic, we have to look at all the evidence and maybe evidence. But it sounded to me like he was suggesting there might be something else. We'll have to see. But if that's the case, this thing is going to get really intense. All right, everybody. We are joined by Congressman Matt Gaetz from down in Florida. He's also the host of the Hot Takes podcast with Matt Gaetz. Congressman, great to have you on the show, sir.
Oh, thanks so much, Buck. And I think the last time I saw you in person, you were hosting the television show Rising here in Washington, D.C. It was like December 18th, 2018. Democrats had just taken power. You asked me on the show what I thought would be the principal objective during their time in control of the House of Representatives. I predicted, regardless of the facts, regardless of the rationale or basis, that the real agenda of Democrats would be impeachment. And we made all kind of news back then, Buck. We got all kind of news stories written up about that interview that a Republican was predicting impeachment that early. Unfortunately, that turned out to be correct in that it was just a totally delegitimizing effort from start to finish. But it's good to be back with you. Hopefully we'll break some more news.
Absolutely, man. And I recall this. So good for you on being right. And fortunately, the president weathered the storm of that sham impeachment quite well. But nonetheless, now we're in the midst of this coronavirus epidemic and really the response epidemic, too. I mean, what the government has done in some places. I want to, you said you're taking a victory lap. It feels for a lot of us, I'm up here in New York City, like Florida gets to take, and the governor there and the folks in charge get to take a bit of a victory lap, too, in terms of being really the model for how to handle this and how to reopen. I just want to know, what have you seen in your home state? Why did it work out so well? Relatively speaking, of course.
Yeah, the biggest difference is that some governors followed the news cycle and other governors followed the evidence. Ron DeSantis made a series of really good choices as the governor of Florida that resulted in a lower intubation rate, hospitalization rate, and death rate. Meanwhile, the actual choices made by folks like Governor Cuomo in New York really put vulnerable people at risk. In Florida, we didn't discharge people from the hospital with potential coronavirus back into nursing homes and long-term care facilities. I mean, we've got a lot of senior citizens in Florida. We're sort of God's waiting room down in the Sunshine State, and it has helped our people to not be so, I guess, overly responsive to the calls for 80,000 ventilators and entirely new hospitals built. There's also some specific things we're doing in Florida that are helping us snuff out some of these hotspots. We're doing sentinel testing. We're doing surveillance testing. Where instead of just waiting around for a problem to emerge, we're actually trying to figure out, as it's happening, where we can deploy the most resources. So our governor stopped flights in from New York. He stopped some of those folks from Louisiana from coming over and going to the beach in my beautiful district for a while. And I think that type of an evidence-based approach has been more effective than, like the daily press conferences, but also rapidly rising daily death tolls in places like New York.
Speaking of Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida, also host of the Hot Takes podcast. Congressman, what do you think about the stages that we're in right now for the reopening and what needs to happen at the congressional level? I mean, Congress has passed. There's been a lot of spending going on, some of it understandable, some of it seems a little more suspect. What needs to happen to get the economy back into, the president just spoke to me earlier about the transition to greatness. We had him on the show. So how do we get there, and what's Congress's role in that, given where we are right now?
Well, first I'll say it is quite something how much of a fan of yours the president is. Sometimes I'll just wake up and it'll be like 34 Buck Sexton retweets from the president. So obviously you're making an impact, and he's a big fan of the show. I will say that when you pour $9 trillion onto the economy, as we've done through appropriating funds and Fed policy, that is a shock to any system, right? And we hope it sort of shocks us back into a vibrant economy like we had prior to this terrible coronavirus. The expectation I have is that it will take some time to get that properly deployed. I don't think that we just, immediately snap back. I think that there's going to be that transitionary period. And I think one of the most important things we can do is pass sensible liability reforms. Right now, there are some businesses who are concerned about the cadre of lawyers assembling to feed off of this novel circumstance that none of us have ever encountered before. And so by having some reasonable liability reform, I think that helps us get open and rolling again. And ultimately, there is no amount of Fed policy or spending from the government that can in and of itself restore consumer confidence. If you think about the beginning of the Trump presidency, what really was the touchstone of this energized economy was rising investor confidence, rising consumer confidence, the belief that if people made these investments, that ultimately they would see a return on those investments. And I think that just is going to be somewhat of a gradual process before we get to a vaccine.
Now, also, the president signed an executive order having to do with social media platforms and saying essentially if they don't act as neutral platforms, if they're going to engage in speech policing, there will be consequences. And people are now learning, Congressman Gaetz, about this Section 230 and publisher versus platform and laws that affect whether or not you're liable for what's posted on your site. Can you just give us, you sit on the antitrust committee in Congress. Can you tell us what's really going on here? What's at the heart of this fight over Twitter and Facebook and the bias and the pushback against it? We know there's bias, so what's going on with the fight against it?
Yeah, let's start with two truths. One, big tech is biased against conservatives. I think that's been well evidenced. Second, big tech buys off Congress. They've got multiple tech lobbyists for every member of the United States Senate. And as a consequence of the outsized power that they have with the Congress through their donations that I don't take. And by the way, I don't take any federal PAC donations. I find the whole thing a bit unseemly. But what big tech has done is they've carved out a special protection in the law that the Buck Sexton show doesn't get, that CNN and Fox News don't get, that my podcast, Hot Takes with Matt Gaetz, doesn't get. And that protection allows them to hold themselves out as a neutral, unbiased platform and then not be liable for the content or the metering or the suppression of people's views. And I believe that if technology companies want that special benefit provided by the government, it has to be lashed to some transparency. Like, we should not just accept as an article of faith that Twitter is fair, or Facebook, or really any other platform, right? They should have to prove it. They should have to open the kimono a little bit and demonstrate that there isn't suppression of viewpoint. And for all of the libertarian thinkers out there who would say, well, that's regulating a private company, my answer would be that we as the government, when we create a special carve-out, we depart from the type of free market practices that ought to animate our First Amendment values. So I'm glad that the president is going right at the specific immunities that allow big tech to suppress conservatives. But we also need the Department of Justice to get engaged by enforcing our antitrust laws. And I would suggest we need the Federal Election Commission engaged. Today, I'm filing a Federal Election Commission complaint against Twitter because of the way that they've treated President Trump. And any voter can do that. I would encourage others to do that, because when they disadvantage the president, that is a corporate contribution to a campaign, and that's illegal, and it would be a contribution that exceeds the limits when you look at the value that the Twitter platform provides.
Do you think that some of these mega companies in social media, Congressman Gaetz, do you think that they should be broken up? I mean, are they monopolies? You're a guy who knows antitrust.
I don't think you can paint them all with the same brush. I am very concerned about some of the information we found in our bipartisan investigation of Amazon, that they will literally onboard, some small business selling a widget onto their platform. Then they'll steal the IP, send it off to China, and get the same widget replicated at a lower price to put perhaps an American small business out of business. That would be the very definition of using your market size and power to try to hurt people. And so if there's stuff like that going on, then yes, I do believe that there are antitrust tools in the law that allow us to break up a company like Amazon, if in fact that is evidenced and if in fact there's due process provided. When it comes to the digital online platforms and the speech and communication, I'm not entirely sure that we have to go as far as breaking them up. But I certainly think we can use the tools in the law to require transparency and then to punish them when they do things like shadow ban Republicans in Congress. I mean, you'll remember, Buck, there were 4 Republicans shadow banned during the Russia hoax: Devin Nunes, Mark Meadows, Jim Jordan, and Matt Gaetz. And Twitter said, well, that was just a bug in their system. Well, it's one hell of a bug that only seems to bite the conservative Republicans who back the president. So when there are those events that reveal themselves, we ought to have tough consequences.
Well, what are the tech liaisons that you deal with in Capitol Hill? I mean, the people that represent these big companies, when they're presented with this, and we're speaking to Congressman Matt Gaetz, you should check out his podcast, Hot Takes, which you listen wherever you get your podcasts. Congressman, what do they say? It seems so apparent because there's never a prominent, Ilhan Omar has never been, banned from Twitter, or, AOC, or, other people who are often pushing controversial points of view and are clearly highly political. It only happens on the right. Does Twitter or Facebook, do they have some explanation that they offer up for this, or is it just, it's a coincidence?
I've found that it's very hard to shame the shameless, Buck. We recently had one of those very Facebook liaisons before the House Judiciary Committee, and they were talking about how fair and equal and just their platform was, but they couldn't seem to answer my questions about why an account called Milkshakes Against Republicans was able to post that they wanted to see more Republicans shot during baseball practice as a consequence of our political views. I complained about that. I went to Twitter's headquarters and showed it to them, and it took them months to take down that post. And then I don't believe they ever even deplatformed the account that said that Republicans should be shot at baseball practice. And, that's not like esoteric. That's not hypothetical. My friend and one of my mentors, Steve Scalise, was shot at baseball practice. And so I think that double standard is something that we have to continue to highlight in evidence. It's why I'm hopeful that the White House, that the reports are true, that the White House is going to establish a commission to review specific instances of unfair bias against really against any political group. I mean, I think we need to have a system in place that allows ideas to be criticized and evaluated, whether they're right wing, left wing, in the middle, or whatever. And I think right now we just have a situation where, I don't want Washington running my life, but I sure as hell don't want Silicon Valley running my life.
Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida. Everyone, check out his podcast, Hot Takes with Matt Gaetz. Congressman, appreciate it. Come back anytime, sir.
Thanks, Buck. I appreciate it, man.